All right, so today we're going to discuss cybersecurity and how it's going to be the future of doing business, whether you're in the public or private sector. So this is a two-part presentation. The first part that I'm going to discuss will be some basic cybersecurity fundamentals that all organizations should know. And then the second part that I'll be discussing will be the new cybersecurity maturity model certification requirements that are being pushed down by the Department of Defense. So let's get started. All right, so first and foremost, people need to understand that cybersecurity affects everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a baker or you sell widgets. Cybersecurity has changed how we all do business. Most organizations have public-facing websites, point-of-sale systems, credit card processing, bookkeeping, you name it. You have to use a computer and a network to do it. So here's some fast facts on the impact cybercrimes have on organizations around the United States. So in 2018, the FBI released a report stating that the damage caused by cybercrimes exceeded $2 billion. And the biggest issue is that smaller organizations don't have the resources and infrastructure to protect themselves, which leads to smaller organizations being targeted. Recently, the SBA surveyed small business owners, and 88% of them said that they felt their business were vulnerable to a cyber attack. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how can you protect yourself from being attacked and becoming a target? And the good news is there are some things that you can do that can help shield you from such threats. But in order to protect yourself, you have to be able to identify what the threats are. And so the first threat, so here's some of the threats. The first threat is malicious software called ransomware. Now, ransomware is exactly what it says. It's software that's holding your data hostage by encrypting your file unless you pay the ransom. The ransom can range anywhere from a few $100 to thousands of dollars. Once your files are encrypted, without paying the ransom, you won't be able to decrypt your files. So those files will be lost forever. Just a little over a week ago, the camera company Canon had 10 terabytes worth of data stolen and held ransom. Canon refused to pay the ransom, and this past week, the attackers published their unencrypted data. So how do you protect yourself? Simply keeping your operating system and antivirus solution up to date with the latest security patches and updates is one solution. And a word of advice, please stay away from Kaspersky Antivirus. The software is created in Russian labs and has been banned by the Department of Defense due to privacy concerns. And so this is an example of what ransomware looks like. Right, so if you don't pay the ransom, they're going to keep your files forever. All right, next we have viruses, and no, not corona. Viruses come in many forms, but some of the things that they can do is collect your information without your knowledge and send it to third parties. They can capture information such as your username and password and send it to third parties. Also, they can take you to unwanted sites that you didn't even click on and even flood your computer with pop-ups to the point where productivity can come to a halt. Installing a good antivirus solution can help protect your organization. Most antivirus solutions are signature-based. That means that if the virus has certain characteristics, the antivirus solution will recognize it and block it. Also, there's some antivirus solutions that will perform real-time scanning of all your files to make sure that your system is always protected. Here's an example of a real-life example of what the Cont virus being detected and quarantined by an antivirus program. So the antivirus solution will allow you to delete the program out of your system or restore it if it accidentally flagged the program as a virus when it wasn't. All right, so next up we have phishing attacks. Okay, so a phishing attack is where an attacker will contact you typically through email. The attacker will pose as a legitimate business. There are two solutions to not become a victim. The first is education. Educating yourself and your employees to recognize potential attacks is the first step every organization should take. All the technology in the world does you no good if an employee accidentally lets someone into your network. So, for example, the attacker will send you an email that looks like it legitimately came from SunTrust Bank. In the email, it will say something that will get your attention, like your password's been compromised or a transaction needs your approval. The attacker will provide a link in that email for you to click on to resolve this, quote unquote issue. Now, it'll take you to a fake site where you'll put in your username and password. Now the attacker has your login credentials. And in 2018, the FBI estimated that roughly 26,000 people fell victim to phishing attacks, totaling over $48 million. Example of a phishing email where the attacker was trying to pose a SunTrust bank. Notice that the name in the email address is spelled incorrectly. The R is missing from the word trust. This is a huge telltale that the email is not from a legitimate source. Another thing you can do is hover your mouse over the link, and the path will come up on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So for example, if the link says SunTrust, when you hover your mouse over the link, it should say https://suntrust.com on the bottom portion of your browser. Also keep in mind that most legitimate organizations will never ask you for your password or sensitive information. And lastly, we have spyware. Now, spyware is interesting because there's several different kinds ranging from adware to keyloggers. They all have the same goal, which is to take your sensitive data and transmit it without your knowledge. One way they do this is through the use of what's called adware or advertising software. The software will create advertisement pop-ups. And now the attacker gets paid for each time an advertisement pops up. Sometimes the pop-ups will appear to be in the form of an unclosable window. So here's an example of what adware can do to your system, and you can imagine how quickly this can get out of control. You'd never be able to get any work done. Lastly, if we have keyloggers. The malicious software records every stroke and key you type. Attackers can use this information to log into your bank account, your social media account, and other websites where usernames and passwords are used. So here's an example of what a keylogger can do. You see the victim's username and password was captured. Now the attacker can take their login credentials and go as far as locking out the victim from their own account. And just like I mentioned earlier, the two solutions to these types of attacks are through educating yourself and your employees to not click on unverified links or attachments and using an antivirus solution. I can't stress it enough that it doesn't matter how much technology you have protecting your systems if your users are not educated. One user can bring your entire business to a grinding halt. So that concludes the first part of the presentation, and I'm now going to dive into the DoD requirements called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model. So what is the CMMC, and how does it apply to you and your organization? So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification is very similar to the CMMI. There's 5 certification levels ranging from basic cyber hygiene at level 1 to advanced cyber hygiene at level 5. The model was developed by the Department of Defense to specifically address the defense industrial base's cybersecurity deficiencies. Now the model is a collection of various standards and requirements rolled into one. Now this is where it's going to get interesting. Under the current NIST 800-171 requirements, anyone handling CUI must apply all control requirements and self-attest that they are indeed in compliance with those requirements. But under the CMMC, third-party assessors will come to your business and certify that you are indeed meeting those requirements, so self-assessments will no longer be allowed. So Katie Arrington is the Chief Information Security Officer for Acquisition and Sustainment. She is the one that's heading this effort. At an event, Katie said that adversaries such as nation-state actors weren't targeting the Lockheed Martins and Northrop Grummans of the world because those organizations have the resources and capabilities to defend themselves. So instead, adversaries are now going after small businesses in the defense industrial base. So on July 23rd, 2019, the DoD Inspector General published a report called the Audit of Protection of DoD-controlled unclassified information on contractor-owned networks and systems. They assessed 10 contractors with DoD contracts worth at least $1 million to evaluate their security controls to protect CUI. And the result was 9 out of the 10 contractors failed for various reasons, such as failing to identify network and system vulnerabilities, lack of multi-factor authentication, failing to mitigate vulnerabilities identified on their networks, and placing CUI on unprotected removable media. And so these examples revealed that contractors and subcontractors lack the complete understanding of the various regulations and technical requirements, and demonstrated the current system of self-attestation was not sufficient to protect SCI, which is federal contract information, and CUI, controlled unclassified information data, from advanced persistent threats such as nation-state actors and insider threats. And so this was one of the bases for the creation of the CMMC, is to have that verification mechanism. So here is the CMMC timeline for this year. At the end of January, version 1.0 of the CMMC model was released. And then in March, version 1.02 was released with minor changes. This is the current version. That's why I have it highlighted in red. And this past Monday, the CMMC accreditation body closed the provisional assessor program and will begin the process of selecting the 72 provisional assessors. Now, in the beginning of November, the CMMC requirements will begin to pop up in RFPs, requests for proposals. Since most of the work has been remote, there will not be much of a delay due to COVID-19. Katie Arrington said that there's a possibility initial audits may be delayed about 2 weeks. So here's an example of the CMMC levels I mentioned in the previous slides. So the levels are cumulative. So for example, if you're a level 1 organization, you'll perform the 17 practices. Now, once you go to level 2, you'll perform the 17 practices from level 1 and an additional 55 practices for level 2. And it just keeps on building on top of each other the higher up you go. So the CMMC consists of 17 domains. Each domain has practices that you'll need to meet to become compliant. So for example, under the physical protection domain, one of the requirements is that visitors will need to be escorted when they're visiting your facility. So the CMMC focuses on 2 data types that need to be protected: controlled unclassified information and federal contract information. So under a CMMC level 1, the focus is on protecting federal contract information. Now, I'm all about giving examples because I think it helps people relate how it ties to them and their businesses. So let's say you're the owner of a landscaping company called Lawn and Order Lawn Care, and you're awarded a contract to provide landscaping services at Patrick Air Force Base. That's considered federal contract information and must be protected by implementing the 17 practices in CMMC level 1. For CMMC level 2, the focus is on protecting CUI from those that can directly influence the CUI environment. So let's say you're the owner of the Clean Berets Cleaning Company and you're awarded a contract to provide cleaning services for MacDill Air Force Base. Although the cleaning personnel may not have logical access to the CUI environment, they still have the potential to directly influence the CUI environment because they have access to the rooms and buildings. And so in this instance, the cleaning organization must implement the 17 practices in level 1 and the 55 practices of level 2 to be certified. Under CMMC level 3, the focus is on the protection of the CUI environment. And the CUI environment is any organization that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. So let's say you're the owner of Acme Aircraft Manufacturing. You're awarded a contract to produce airplane parts for Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. If your contract has CUI, the DFARS 252.204-7012 clause will be stated in your contract. So since the organization processes, stores, or transmits CUI, they must implement the 17 practices from level 1, the 55 practices from level 2, and the 58 practices from level 3 for a total of 130 practices. Now, please understand that all organizations today storing, processing, or transmitting CUI should already be compliant with the NIST 800-171 requirements per the DFARS clause. And the deadline for that was December 31st, 2017. So if you're not in compliance right now, you open your organization to liability with the False Claims Act. The False Claims Act goes something like this. You as a business owner attest to the government that you're in compliance with the DFARS clause. An employee in your organization blows the whistle that you aren't in compliance. The federal government sues you in federal court, and if the federal government wins, a portion of that settlement is awarded to the employee who blew the whistle. Last year, the federal government sued Cisco over selling video surveillance systems to state and federal agencies that Cisco knew contained software flaws, which led to some of the agencies being hacked. Cisco settled for an $8.6 million lawsuit, and it made it the first successful False Claims Act lawsuit over cybersecurity. So what is CUI? CUI is information that requires safeguarding but is not classified under Executive Order 13526. So CUI comes in 2 types, basic and specified. And under defense, for example, one of the categories is controlled technical information. which is technical information with any military or space application. Research and engineering data, engineering drawings, data sets, technical reports, technical orders. These are all examples of controlled technical information. So here I'm going to break down of what the CMMC certification process for organization will go through. So first, your organization would contact a certified third-party assessment organization to schedule a certification assessment. The C3PAO will send an assessor to your organization, and the assessor will perform the CMMC assessment based on your required level. Once the assessment is complete, the assessor will provide the assessment results to the C3PAO, which will review it. The C3PAO will then send the assessment results to the CMMC accreditation body to issue the organization a certification. And the CMMC accreditation body will review the results and issue the certification to the organization. With that certification, your organization can now be awarded contracts across the entire DoD. And right now, I'm going to go through the entire CMMC Maturity Level 1 requirements and what you need to do to prepare your organization to become compliant. So the CMMC Maturity Level 1 requirements consists of these 6 domains. There's 17 practices, and each practice is aligned with the Federal Acquisitions Regulation. So the first domain is access control. The first practice is AC.1.001, which states limit information system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users, or devices. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that your organization must only allow authorized users onto the organizational information systems on the corporate network. Each organization will need to determine how that is done, which is typically through an access control policy. The next practice, AC.1.002, states limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. So this is essentially the principle of least privilege, meaning a user is given a minimum amount of access in order for them to perform their duties. So this is similar to the first practice, but instead of limiting users to the information systems, once the user has been granted access, you limit what information they can now access. Just because you have access to the system doesn't mean you get to have free reign of all the information stored on it. So for example, a janitor would need to have access to an information system to do their time card, but they would not need access to the financial data of the company since that would be outside of the scope of their job duties, and he would not have a legitimate business need to know. AC 1.003 states verify and control/limit connections to and use of external information systems. So this is focused on outbound connections of your network, and it's geared toward preventing the exfiltration of sensitive data out of your network domain. Several years ago, Target and Home Depot were both the victims of sensitive data being exfiltrated, and essentially their point of sale systems were compromised, and those systems were communicating sensitive data out of the Target and Home Depot networks and to sites that had no business relevance. And so the last practice for the access control domain is AC.1.004, and it states control information posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. Now the focus here is on preventing the posting of federal contract information on publicly accessible systems, such as your company website. The posting of sensitive information on publicly accessible systems isn't always intentional, but it does require users to be educated, and they must understand what should and should not be publicly posted. So the second domain is identification and authentication. Now the first practice is IA.1.076, and it states identify information system users, processes acting on behalf of users or devices. The keyword here is identify, meaning a username matches an individual within the organization. So when you log on to the system, the most common way of identifying yourself is through a username. For example, if my username is Jay Bourne, the system identifies me as Jason Bourne. Once I input my password, the system authenticates who I am. This information can be verified in audit records, which can be used for forensic analysis in the event of a breach. And it can paint a picture as to who did what and hold those responsible and accountable for their actions. And this is why it's security best practice to not use group accounts, since identifying a specific user to an action is almost virtually impossible. The next practice is IA.1.077, which states authenticate or verify that identities to those users, processes, or devices as a prerequisite to allowing access to organizational information systems. So in other words, in the last practice, we talked about how users are identified, but in this practice, we're talking about how users are authenticated or prove they are who they say they are. And the most common authentication method is the use of a password. So regarding devices, some devices such as routers will be shipped from the factory with a default username and password, such as admin for both fields. This requirement is simply asking you to authenticate users, and although passwords are a weak authentication method, this would satisfy the requirement. Security best practice would be to implement multi-factor authentication, such as adding the use of biometrics and smart cards. The third domain is media protection. So the first practice is MP.1.118, which states sanitize or destroy information system media containing federal contract information before disposal or release for reuse. So basically all media ranging from CDs, DVDs, thumb drives, paper printouts, hard drives, they all have to be either destroyed or sanitized. There are CD, DVD, and paper shredders available at different retailers at reasonable cost. There are also services where personnel come to your place of business, take all the media you want destroyed, and then they provide you with a certificate of destruction. And this is a good piece of evidence that can be provided to an assessor when they come to your businesses to verify this control. You're more than welcome to destroy it yourself, but just be sure you're maintaining a record of it for the assessment purposes. All right, the fourth domain is physical protection. So the first practice is PE.1.131, and it states limit physical access to organizational systems, equipment, and the respective operating environments to authorized individuals. So the key focus here is on not allowing unauthorized individuals physical access to your system and equipment, such as your server room. Placing locks on certain doors to protect the environment limits that access and meets the requirement for this control. The next practice is PE.1.132, and it states escort visitors and monitor visitor activity. I've seen so many instances of where a visitor arrives at a work site and is friends with an employee there, and that visitor is allowed to roam the entire campus freely without the employee escorting them. And this is a huge security risk to an organization. Security best practice would be to be staying within an arm's reach of your visitors when they're being escorted through the work site. That way you always have someone keeping an eye on them from doing anything malicious. The next practice is PE.1.133, and it states maintain audit logs of physical access. Anytime an employee arrives at the work site, they should always sign in when they arrive and sign out when they leave. And depending on the complexity of your organization, signing in and signing out of each room and location can turn into insanity. So another common method is using proximity card swipes at all your doors, which not only acts as an access control device, but also keeps a log of employees entering and leaving facilities. This also applies to visitors as well. Organizations can issue visitor badges or use a visitor logbook. Information that should be captured should be the date, the time, their name, what organization they're representing, and who they're there to see. The next practice is PE.1.134, and it states control and manage physical access devices. Just think of the word devices as locking mechanisms. So for example, if an employee has a set of metal keys, when they leave the company, the doors need to be rekeyed because you don't know if that employee made copies of the keys. Another example is employees having proximity cards. Another example is employees having proximity cards. They can turn them in when they leave the organization. I mean, if they choose to keep it, the proximity cards can be revoked. Proximity cards can still be susceptible to copying. It's still not perfect, but it's better than having to rekey an entire building. All right, the fifth domain is system and communications protection. So the first practice is SC.1.175, and it states monitor and control and protect organizational communications transmitted or received by organizational information systems at the external boundaries and key internal boundaries of the system. So what you're doing here is you're controlling what information can flow out. And that's all you're doing, right? And you can, accomplish this by using various solutions, right? Firewall rules, VLANs, VPNs. You're essentially controlling the information that leaves the organization. The next practice, SC.1.176, states implement subnetworks for publicly accessible system components that are physically or logically separated from internal networks. And so this focuses on implementing multiple networks. So for the purposes of the CMMC, anything that's FCI or CUI has to be in an isolated environment. So you would have one network for employees needing FCI access and another network for employees not needing FCI access. And then you have one network for guest access in case if you wanted to have a network guest while they're waiting in your lobby. All right, and the final domain is system and information integrity. So the first practice is SI.1.210, which states identify, report, and correct information and information system flaws in a timely manner. So this is essentially your organization performing system patching. A few years ago, Equifax didn't patch their Apache web server for some unknown reason. Long story short, it led to them being breached 4 months after the patches had been released. So it's vitally important that organizations understand that there is a mandatory reporting requirement of all cyber incidents discovered within 72 hours. And I cannot stress that enough. The DFAR 7012 clause listed defines what a cyber incident is. The next practice, SI.1.211, states, provide protection from malicious code at appropriate locations within organizational information systems. What this control focuses on is on the protection of your various components in your organization, such as your mail server, your web server, your endpoints. You can protect your network and organization by implementing things like antivirus, anti-malware, and isolating network segments. So if there's an adverse event that does happen, your most sensitive data is the least impacted. The next practice, SI.1.212, and it states update malicious code protection mechanisms when new releases are available. So that means that when your antivirus system is bugging you to update its definitions, that you don't continue to ignore it. Keeping your antivirus definitions updated helps protect your organizations from malicious software we talked about earlier. And the final practice is SI.1.213, which states perform periodic scans of the information systems and real-time scans of files from external sources as files are downloaded, opened, or executed. And so what this means is that you have anti-malware installed that scans every time you download or open any files. Most antivirus solutions nowadays have real-time scanning, which is part of their packages, so you can knock out 2 birds with 1 stone. So if you're going to be doing business with the DoD, or you're already doing business with the DoD, it is imperative that you begin preparing now. The DoD has identified that there's over 350,000 contractors and subs in the defense industrial base. Now, there's not that many assessors, and this new requirement is going to make that demand for assessors even higher. So I urge you not to wait until the last minute to get prepared, or you run the risk of not being awarded or maintaining your contract. Oh, excuse me. All contractors and subs will need to be CMMC certified to maintain and or be awarded a contract with the DoD. So at minimum, a contractor or sub will be required to be certified at CMMC Level 1. It doesn't matter if you have a contract making buttons, the DoD will still require you to be a CMMC Level 1. Now, these requirements are going to begin to appear in the request for proposals this November, and the cost of the certification will be considered an allowable cost, so you'll be able to get reimbursed by the DoD for the cost of certification. Now, I've included a few important websites for you to check out. The first one is the official CMMC website. They have a very, very good FAQ section. I highly recommend you check it out. The second website is the official CMMC accreditation body, which will train assessors like myself to come to your organization and certify you. And the last website is the official National Archives website, and that's where CUI is discussed in further detail. I'd like to thank everyone for their time, and at this time, I'm more than happy to take your questions.